Here at CSIS. It's a great privilege for me to have my friend Mr. Andrew Mitchell here in Washington. I consider Andrew Mitchell to be one of the most thoughtful, most strategic political leaders on international development that's ever held a senior responsibility in international development. Whether it's the United Kingdom, whether it's the United States, whether it's France, whether it's one of the multilateral institutions, I consider Andrew Mitchell to be one of the smartest, most strategic, most thoughtful people. We need folks like Mr. Mitchell now more than ever. I think he makes very cogent arguments, and I think you'll see why I wanted to have Mr. Mitchell here in Washington. I don't think he needs much of an introduction other than to say he was shadow minister for development starting in 2005 for 5 years until 2010. So he really understood the brief, and then took the development ministry job in 2010 when David Cameron became prime minister, and led DfID brilliantly. And one of the things that he did, which I hope the United States will follow suit on, is conduct what was called a bilateral aid review and a multilateral aid review. I was at the World Bank when he sent the letter to the World Bank saying, we're going to look at what you're doing, and it put the fear of God in the bureaucracy. So I think he did that across 43 different international organizations, and I know that the UK government has just recently redid it, and we should be following their very good example. There are many other things we can learn from Andrew Mitchell's time in government and also from the UK development experience, and I think this is a moment to be listening and learning from our friends across the pond. So thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for being here.
Thank you, Dan.
Could you? So I want to first start with if we were celebrating American Thanksgiving and I had my relatives around the table, most of whom are fairly skeptical about international development, or if we were in a British pub and these were Daily Mail readers, what would you say to them about why international development matters and why it's important?
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks you to all of you for coming. It's clear that both in Britain and in America, the cause of international development is facing some pretty heavy headwinds. And it's always impertinent, really, for a foreigner to come along and give prescriptive answers to some of these questions. But there is a very strong case to be made for the exercise of soft power. And you have to make a case around the Thanksgiving table or with your mother, Dan, who I know is a skeptic on these matters. You have to make a case that doesn't confront people and say that they're wrong in their view, but which tries to appeal to aspects that they may respect or they may think about. And the truth is that we live at the moment in a very unequal world where, because of globalization, something has happened which has never happened before, and it is that the people who live in grinding poverty and utter misery know that elsewhere there are people living a very good life. And as a result of that, some of them want to migrate to that better life, and others of them feel very alienated because they know enough to know that not far away, in a globalized world, there are people who are not experiencing the grinding poverty, insecurity, misery, disease, lack of education, abuse of human rights that they are experiencing. And alienation is one of the big threats to the developed world. It's a big threat to you. You see it in the president's wish to keep out of the country people whom he thinks could be a threat. And it's important to understand this alienation. You know, defeating ISIL, where mercifully everyone agrees that ISIL needs to be militarily defeated, Russia, China, Britain, France, America, we all agree that there is a military solution required to dealing with ISIL, but dealing with ISIL militarily is 10% of the task. 90% of the task is trying to stop the circumstances in which people sign up to this appalling death cult nihilism which ISIL represents. And that is where soft power comes in. You can defeat these people militarily, but the 90% is trying to stop the alienation that they and their families and their communities face. And in looking at the tools of soft power, I would mention just two ways that I hope America will look at doing this. The United Nations is a very frustrating organization. We all know that. Though when everyone agrees, it confers quite extraordinary power in reaching a consensus and confers extraordinary legitimacy. Now, instead of attacking the UN, America's a very big part of the UN, you should do, in my submission, Dan, what we did in Britain. And what we did is we said we're going to review every agency, World Bank, as you mentioned, which came out incredibly well, but review every UN agency on two parameters. The first is this agency spending American tax dollars well? And the second one is it spending it in America's interest? And if you look through that prism at how a UN agency is performing, you do two things immediately. The first is that you underline value for money. That will comfort a lot of people because they'll think that you have looked about value for money in America's interest, and you've been clear about that. And the other thing is it will change the way the agency thinks, because a lot of these agencies haven't really been looked at very hard since 1947, when some of them were set up. And they operate on the basis that they get a budget, the budget will go up, and you have to give them the money. But suddenly, if you put them through a process like the multilateral aid review, it flips the whole thing over. They've now got to justify their spending. And what we did, and I'm delighted to see in the audience my principal private secretary when I had responsibility for these matters, what we did is we had the self-confidence to put all the stuff out there. It was all on the internet. So if we were criticizing an agency, not only did we peer review what we were saying with the experts, we also put it out and they could have a response. And of course, this led to quite a degree of upset within the system. And it means you can pick the winners, because you can say, as we did, well, UNICEF is doing great work, and so we want to double the core funding which we give to UNICEF because they're delivering value for money and they're doing things which are in Britain's interests. Similarly, with one of the aid, we axed 10% of them. We say we're not giving any more money to this agency because it doesn't deliver, and you then get the blowback from representations. I remember the Prime Minister in Britain's Chief of Staff ringing me up to say that we couldn't possibly take a particular action against one of them, and I discovered that he'd had a very good lunch with the best friend of the chap who ran this agency in New York, and we faced them down. We did what was required. On the basis of empirical evidence and not nudges and winks. And I strongly commend that approach now at the current state of the debate in America. And the other thing we set up was an independent watchdog. And the answer to the aid skeptics, the answer in Britain to the Daily Mail and the Times newspaper, who are engaged in a very strenuous attack on aid and development at the moment, is go to the independent commission. If you think money's being ill spent, go to the independent watchdog. And we set this watchdog up, and it would be fair to say that most people in the development world were very skeptical about setting it up. They said you're putting the judgment on development into the hands of bean counters, a sort of derogatory term for accountants. And development is very long tail. You can't judge it in this way. But actually you can. And the critical thing is that a watchdog must not report to the executive, must not report to the government, because governments and ministers can sweep inconvenient truths under the table. A watchdog that reports to the legislature, that reports to Congress or to the Senate, without fear and favour, and is guided by someone from the legislature on what they're going to look at, and is funded to do that and achieve that, that is a very good way of objectively saying whether the money is well spent or not. And because we spend so much, you spend 25% of all that is spent globally. In America, you have an absolute right as citizens who pay your tax dollars for development to know that that money is being well spent. And I think it's those two things are very good disciplines to inject into the debate at the moment. And we offer it from across the Atlantic as your friends and allies.
Mr. Mitchell, could just spend a little bit more time on the issue on those topics of a multilateral aid review in the independent body. It does not report for example, the independent body does not report to the Minister for International Development, reports to someone else, correct?
Yeah, the way it works is that the watchdog reports to the Parliamentary Select Committee. So it is a parliamentary body composed exclusively of legislators, with no one from the executive who the Independent Commission report to. Now, they can be tasked. When we set it up, I wanted to make sure that the Secretary of State could say, will you look at this? And the Select Committee set them their task, and they can come up with their own ideas on what they want to look at. So you want a basket of influences on what they look at, but that they do it objectively, that they are funded by DfID, but they are funded in agreement with the chairman of the Select Committee. There is a subcommittee of the Select Committee which deals exclusively with the watchdog. And it proves very effective. You know, I remember one of the first things they looked at was corruption. And a very senior civil servant came to me and said, they've produced this interesting report on corruption, but we don't have to do all the things they say. And I said, well, actually, you know, we do, because we'll get them back, and they will come back anyway to say whether we've acted properly on their suggestions, and we will be held accountable for that. So actually, you can't pick and choose. Once you have a watchdog which says something needs to be done, you have to address those points very directly.
Multilateral aid review. When I said earlier, I was at the World Bank Group, and we got a brisk and sobering letter from DfID saying we want within 60 days time or 90 days time a full accounting of what we're getting for all the pounds that we're putting into your institution. It was, I think, a new experience for my multilateral colleagues. I think it's a great idea. So could you just talk, there were several agencies that you plussed up as a result of it. Just spend a minute about on who did it, how was it conducted, what were the questions that were asked in the multilateral aid review, and what was the upshot of it in terms of when the smoke cleared, what happened in terms of who came out ahead and who perhaps didn't come out so well.
Okay, the key part was that we were trying to establish value for money in each case, and whether they were pursuing British interests. So it was quite possible for an agency to be doing very well on value for money, but actually not to be in Britain's interest. And I can't remember precisely, but I think there were 2 or 3 industrial-related agencies.
Yeah, UNIDO got in trouble.
UNIDO got axed.
ILO got in trouble. The International Labour Organization.
ILO did, but we continue to use ILO on specific cases, and there were certainly examples.
They got a yellow card.
Well, no, they got less core funding, but they got money for specific projects and specific work that we wanted carried out, where they competed and were effective.
But so you reduced spending to several organizations, the exact ones, 2 or 3 of them, but you had several civil servants look at each one of these and ask the questions of value for money and British interest on each one of them.
Yes. So there was the 2 key questions were: is it value for money and is it British interest? So you could lose out because it wasn't British interest while you were spending good value for money, but it could work the other way around. So, for example, we found inadequacies in the Commonwealth Secretariat. So they did badly on the value for money, but equally Britain clearly couldn't turn its back on the Commonwealth Secretariat, so on the British interest they scored very highly.
Right.
But that is a good thing, because that's looking at these things in the round and working out what is in Britain's interest, and both those 2 things, value for money and pursuing what Britain wants to see pursued are very important. Now, the whole thing was done very transparently, so it wasn't, people speaking behind their hands about the effectiveness or otherwise of a particular agency. It was all put out there openly onto the internet. And that's very important too, because that shows it's transparent and open. And of course, holding aid and development accountable is at the heart of maintaining public confidence. And DfID, I would have thought that DfID was almost definitely the most accountable and transparent department in Whitehall, because we publish everything we do through DfID. So that's a very important aspect of it as well.
Just one other key thing, Mr. Mitchell, is that there were several agencies that got more money as a result of this. So you took some money, you had a fixed envelope of money, and at the end of that process, several agencies weren't performing well, weren't meeting these metrics. But then there were others that were doing really well and were recognized for that. Yeah. UNICEF got more money, and several other, I don't know, several other agencies got more money as a result of that process, which I think in the aid world, everybody gets a trophy oftentimes, or agencies, there's sort of a little bit of that feel to it. I think that was a very healthy process. I know your government has, the British government has followed the innovation that you created in 2010 at least once since then.
Yes, and it's important, and it will continue definitely now, I think, and it's the right thing to do.
I hope we do it
and other
here.
Countries, Canada and Australia both have taken an intense interest in it, and at the time actually sent their civil servants across to hear what we were doing. But you're quite right that with UNICEF, we doubled their core funding, which from memory went up by £10 million, and that was just their core funding. We do lots of other things with UNICEF, but UNICEF had showed through this process, they embraced the process of accountability, and they showed how good they were and what they could do. So we applauded that and gave them more money. In the middle category of agencies that were too important to us to cut, we set very strong criteria about how they must improve.
Performance improvement plan.
Yes, and then those that lost out, we explained to them why, and at least one of them has come back.
Come into the good graces again.
They come into the good graces. But the one I particularly thinking of was UNDP, which is a very challenged agency. It was last run brilliantly by a British official called Mark Malloch Brown, who was Kofi Annan's number 2, subsequently a minister in the Labour government, but although he's from a different party to me, ran it brilliantly and was a career development expert and official. But since that time, it may have changed since my day, but it was basically running far too many small projects without enough sort of control and bulk and so forth, and it still continues to do that. And we have very difficult meetings with them because we couldn't withdraw from the UNDP, it was too important, but we needed them to change, and that is something which I think is ongoing.
I want to encourage you in your time here to talk about, I think I don't think it's fully understood, the so-called bilateral aid review and the so-called multilateral aid review here in Washington enough. I think in your meetings here, I would encourage you to talk more about this, because I think this is something that will be of great interest to the new administration and to your interlocutors at other think tanks and in the U.S. Congress. They'll be quite interested in this. I think it's one of your great legacies as when you were the head of DfID. Let me just push just a little bit further on multilateral institutions. There's perhaps, I don't want to call it multilateral institution fatigue or unhappiness with various multilateral institutions. What if you were sitting with the U.S. National Security Advisor at the White House, or you're sitting with hopefully a point person for development or soft power, and I hope we have that person, or you were sitting with the Secretary of State, what would you say about the value, how should the United States remain involved in multilateral institutions, and if so, why? And if we don't get involved in, what are the consequences of that?
Well, there is a consequence of America pulling back, which will be not a very convincing argument to the American administration, but is, I hope, a convincing argument to those of us who care about doing something about these extraordinary inequities and inequalities of opportunity and wealth which disfigure our world today. And that is that the burden share equation changes enormously. America produces 25% of all the aid and development money that is spent around the world. So you have a huge stake in this and a huge stake in its success. And of course, if America pulls back, it will make it that much more difficult for Britain to maintain its spending. So it will have
UK is extremely generous in funding multilateral institutions.
We are, but we don't want to be seen as the funder of last resort, or again, the daily beast will attack us and will make the arguments for aid and development more difficult if Britain is seen to over-shoulder the degree of burden. But that's not an argument which I understand will play very strongly with the American administration, but it is important in terms of the effectiveness of soft power. And if you look around the world at the stresses and strains and threats to the future generations, our children and our grandchildren, they include climate change, migration, and British development policy at its heart is about building stable and prosperous communities overseas so people don't want to migrate to the richer world, but they can build their own lives and their countries in a stable and prosperous environment. So you've got climate change, migration, you've got terror, and you've got protectionism, where everyone knows theoretically that protectionism makes the rich and the poor world poorer, and that freeing up the trading system makes the rich world and the poor world richer. But it's hard, in national policy, if you're defending this particular group of workers, to make the case for free trade. But it is incredibly important. Now, all those four threats require more international cooperation, not less. And at the moment, we live in a world where narrow nationalism is on the march from Moscow down to Cairo. Attacking these issues requires soft power and hard power. It is much easier to confront the issues which lead to terror and fighting and migration through soft power, through preventative measures, and having to confront it with hard power when it gets out of control. And that in the end is the key argument at this stage with the new American administration. If you slash and burn by up to 31%, the money which you're spending, projecting many different areas of soft power, you're going to make America much less secure, because development is about building more prosperous and conflict-free communities. Building those communities makes us in America and in Britain safer and more prosperous, for reasons which I can certainly go into,
yes.
But I think we're all of us familiar with them.
I want to just come back to I know it's a little processy, but I think it's quite important that Washington understand this. A bilateral aid review. You conducted a multilateral aid review, which I believe you had a series of very capable senior civil servants conducted, a sort of a small group that reported to you on the multilateral aid review. And then you also did a similar exercise where you said DfID has a footprint of 30 to 50 countries in the world of particular focus, and ask questions. I'm assuming it was the same set of criteria, which was national interest and value for money. How did you deal with issues such as, I'm thinking of a country like India, which is a middle-income country, or how did you make decisions on some other countries? Did you exit certain countries, and if so, how did you do that, and under what circumstances did you exit countries on a bilateral basis? Okay,
well, you're right. On the multilateral aid, you're quite right that we set the criteria, and then the civil servants, it's not for ministers to interfere in that.
Right,
the ministers set the criteria,
yes,
and the civil service goes and delivers it. And that's served up together with the experts who hang out in organizations like ODI and Sussex and so on.
I resemble that remark.
IDS.
Right, exactly.
To do all of that, and that produced the results. And as I say, it was all very open. So on the
very successful. Yeah.
Bilateral aid review, more complex, because you have to look at what you can achieve. So, for example, you have to balance the fact that in some countries you can spend money very well getting girls into school, and you can show that for a particular level of expenditure you get great results, but in some of the countries of greatest need, it's extremely expensive per girl to get them into school, and therefore, how do you balance the effectiveness of money? What does effectiveness mean and all of that? So it's quite a complex equation. And then you've got historic link. So I felt very strongly, for example, that in Francophone countries, Britain should not be funding development. It should be the French funding of development.
Perfectly reasonable.
So where you have historic links count for a great deal. So, for example, I decided we wouldn't fund Burundi, for which there was quite a lot of blowback, because Burundi was a country with in some tumult and turmoil, and it was destabilizing to the region as well. But we funded them through some multilateral agencies, and it ought to have been the French and the Germans who were indeed funding them, and our program was so small that the cost of administering the program was so great that it didn't make sense. So all these sort of things come into play. And then in India, well, of course, India was a terrible dilemma, and India was by miles the most difficult, because if you look at India, 3 of the states that are the poorest, were they countries, not states, would be 3 of the poorest countries in the world.
And large countries at that.
And very large countries indeed. And you could invest $1,000 in some parts of India through proper, well-structured, well-guided, developed institutional mechanisms. And in other parts, you couldn't invest $100 because there simply weren't the mechanisms there. And you had 25% of all the malnourished children in the world living in India. So you had great need, on the one hand, for development, and yet India had a space program and had its own
Has a starter aid program.
It had its own aid program,
Yep.
and of course it was buying military equipment.
I hope from the Brits or the Americans. I fear not, though.
Not necessarily.
Not
Chinese
necessarily.
seem to come to mind, but
It's quite unfortunate.
But so you've got this incredible equation. So in the end, after a great, and it was one of the best debates in DfID, because everyone pitched in, and there were those who took the sort of realpolitik line that we simply couldn't it would contaminate the rest of the program. And those who looked at it on a pure development basis, that a British development pound would actually have a very big impact in this environment. So in the end, we came up with some very good cliches, like we were walking the last mile with India on development. India had been the biggest development program that Britain had since the Second World War in every single year until 2011. When it was Ethiopia, and then in 2012 when it was Pakistan. So we did change it, and we said that the program would invest in the way that CDC invests, in which case, in theory, the British government will the British taxpayer will get a return.
Yeah.
And we exited out. And actually, I found it extremely difficult, because going and dealing, India has a habit of spitting out white, middle-aged, grey-haired, suited.
This is starting to get a little too personal for me.
Ex-colonial chaps who go down, and they've done it. To the whole raft of British ministers from both parties have been sent back with their tails between their legs.
Sent packing.
So going down and explaining that we were walking the last mile was, a complex business, and we didn't do it awfully well in the end. But it is right that India, which is powering out of poverty, should have the closest possible relationship with Britain. It should be essentially a trade relationship, and I also think there should still be some technical assistance.
I agree with that.
But it should be, we should do it on a bilateral basis where we get something back for it as well.
So, Mr. Mitchell, we did a report 5 years ago called Strategic Foreign Assistance Transitions, looking at, in U.S. history in the last 50 years, when had the U.S. exited a middle-income country? And we looked at Costa Rica, we looked at South Korea, we looked at 3 or 4 others, one in Eastern Europe. It had always been a political decision. It had never been, there wasn't some Excel spreadsheet with the Gini coefficient is here and the GNP per capita is this. It was always a political decision. I think that this administration, the Trump administration, is going to be looking at how to exit countries as part of a budget cutting process. I'm sure they're going to exit on an accelerated basis. So if you were thinking about, given their experience with India, Would you want to do that on a one-year basis? Would you want to phase it out? What would be some of the things you'd be thinking about if you're going to be exiting, say, 10 or 15 countries here? What would be the sort of advice you'd give to the Secretary of State about how to do that?
Well, first of all, you've got to have clear criteria, otherwise you will cause chaos in your foreign relations. If countries think you're picking on them and that you were fairer to another country, you've got to be really very, very careful about that. And of course, there's a view in Britain that South Korea, I remember being questioned in the House of Lords committee, Economic Committee, by a former British finance minister who said, why do we need to give aid to these countries? Look at South Korea. South Korea had the same GDP per head
as Ghana
in 1960, right. And today it's one of the richest countries in the world. And of course, he was wrong about that, because I think that
the U.S.
South
was
Korea
very active.
Billions and billions of pounds of aid went into South Korea.
We had 8 officials sitting in every ministry for about 15 years. It was
yes.
We had to, if you can. So we were quite active in supporting South Korea. So you're right. He was incorrect in saying that it did not get a lot of assistance. Got a ton of assistance.
And South Korea today is giving development aid to poor countries. I once heard the president of South Korea, not the current outgoing one, who of course is in jail at the moment.
Lamentably.
But the president gave a most moving speech, very moving speech, about how his mother had not eaten in order to be able to send him to school in the rubble of the Korean War. Delivered enormously moving. And so getting the criteria right for which countries you're going to withdraw, explaining why, and allowing time. That's very important indeed.
You shouldn't do it in 12 months time. You shouldn't do it in 12 months time.
Signposting it, explaining why, explaining what the criteria are. These are important ways of
I
pursuing such
completely
policy.
agree with you.
But in addition to that, making clear, for example, through organizations like OPIC, that you will go on supporting them. And that's what we have done through CDC, which, in my view, within a couple of years will be widely seen around the world as the best development finance institution that we have. And in 50 years' time, will be seen outside of Britain as the personification of Britain's development effort. It won't be a government department, it will be CDC, because of the provision of patient capital and pioneering capital, which shows what the private sector can do and how it can lift countries out of poverty by investing in jobs and economic opportunity. Incredibly important. So I must say I swallowed hard when I heard that OPIC was either to be axed or not enhanced, which will be, that is an opportunity of showing a country that you're pulling a bilateral program out of, that you will be by their side and investing with them. And of course, if you invest through OPIC in a poor country, as they build up their capital markets, they will want to come back to OPIC for advice and come to New York and London and so forth to build up the capital markets that they themselves are having.
Mr. Mitchell, I want to let's just dwell a minute on development finance and CDC, Commonwealth Development Corporation, not the Centers for Disease Control, but the Commonwealth Development Corporation, which is not as well known here, but it will be because of all the reasons you say. I agree with you. It'll be I believe it has all the potential of being the most important development finance institutions in 5 years' time. I agree with that statement. Could you just dwell a little bit about what did you found CDC, the Commonwealth Development Corporation, in a certain state, and I think you made some significant changes. If I made a list of the 5 or 6 things that is part of your legacy in international development, one of them would be the reorganization of the Commonwealth Development Corporation. Just spend a minute on that, and then maybe reflect a little about the importance of development finance for the future of development. You've done some of that already, but I think it would be helpful for this audience.
Well, I think that one of the changes we made, and I'm not being particularly bipartisan, but we respect very much what Tony Blair did for development because he set up DfID, and all the lessons are that you need for effective development, you need a Department of State for international development in the development world, not a foreign office. If you see the distinction, you need something which, first of all, attracts civil servants who understand that their job is to support international development and not foreign policy, although the two go very closely together. So it brings a clarity of thought and direction. And also it means that under one hat you've got the decision making. And you don't have that in America, and in my view you suffer a bit from that. But to have one person who is responsible for development funding and is accountable to the taxpayer for delivering 100 cents of value on the ground for every tax dollar you're spending is very important. What we did when we came in was to try and add to what the Labour government had done by explaining that although NGOs sometimes see the private sector as the enemy of development, the private sector is in fact the engine of development. Why?
Amen.
Why? Because
Amen.
What lifts people out of poverty is being economically active, having a job, and therefore investment and the private sector are incredibly important. And within the department, we set up a department for the private sector, and officials and ministers felt their way, and that continues to today, and great progress is being made. And I would argue that what ministers today are doing through DfID on the private sector work is incremental, and it's making great progress. Now, with CDC, as the government's 100% owned development finance institution, able to provide long-term capital, not requiring an immediate commercial return or as high a commercial return, but of course always making a profit because it's very bad for capitalism, the free market, to tolerate losses. It's not what you want. It's not the signal you want to send. No. So to have long-term capital does not require a full commercial return, and is doing it in very difficult places. So it's acting as a pioneer for the commercial system is incredibly important. And basically, CDC had lost its way. It had become very much a sort of repository for great old colonial projects, palm oil projects in former British colonies and so forth. And had been loss-making. And when Tony Blair came into power, he wanted to privatize it, which was the most terrible idea. And he then turned it into a fund of funds. So rather like OPIC is today, it was a one-club golfer on the golf course of development, OPIC being a lender, being a debt. And you need lots of different instruments. You need direct investment, loaning,
technical assistance,
all this sort of stuff. And so basically what we have done is we have put it back we've given it back its development roots, but we've also taken away, it was becoming a bit of a sort of city player in the private equity play. We put it back into the middle.
It was a wannabe merchant banker.
Yes, we stopped it from that. We put it back in the middle, so it's now a respected development finance institution. And it was extremely difficult to do because the civil servants inevitably did not have the skill set to make these changes, and it required us to bring in outside banking DNA.
Diana Noble, I think, was the...
And then we got Diana Noble, absolutely right.
And Colin Buckley, a very, very strong leadership team at CDC.
What we had is, and it's an interesting example because I thought that I was, as the Secretary of State at the time, was buying and the private sector was selling in terms of a new CEO, and it rapidly became clear it was the other way around, and that we had to entreat this very able lady to come and be our CEO. And what is so interesting about this is at the time when we started, they were trying to get a new non-executive director. And there were 3 applicants. And about a year ago, they were trying to get 2 new non-executive directors, and they had over 300 applicants. And the reason is the market knows that CDC is now a very exciting, reformed entity, very attractive. And if I was starting my career again now, I might well go to Lazard for a couple of years, but I'd make my way to CDC as fast as I could because I think they're doing a fantastic job.
It's a big part of the future of development.
With real job satisfaction in terms of what they can deliver to do something about these colossal discrepancies that I described.
We just did a report with EDFI, which is the European Association of Development Finance Institutions, sort of the Major League Baseball Commission of DFIs, including CDC, that looked at the massive explosion in the amount of investments that are being catalyzed by development finance institutions. It would be a mistake and an error for the United States to not have certain kinds of authorities and capacities. Whether it's called OPIC or whether it's not is a different question, but having those sorts of instruments, and I agree with you, a larger set of instruments is something we've been advocating here at CSIS for the last 6 years, so I'm in complete agreement with you. I have two other things I wanted to cover, and then I wanted to go to the audience. Could you just spend a minute on, I want to talk about the issue, you touched on it earlier, on the issue of radicalization, and just in terms of why is there radicalization in the world? I am sure that this is going to burn up. If the Trump administration is a two-term presidency, and it's very possible that President Trump could be a two-term president, for his 8 years in government, they will spend an enormous amount of time thinking about radicalization. And there's a military component to it. What percentage of it is military and what percent is not military? And what is driving radicalization, and what can we do about that from an ODA or a soft power standpoint?
Okay, well, I'll give you these are very complex issues, but I'll give you my view. I remember being absolutely horrified by following an event which took place on the Israeli-Lebanese border, when a young woman who was a doctor from a wealthy Lebanese family blew herself up and killed 2 or 3.
So this wasn't a nutter, this wasn't a homeless person, this was a person with a PhD.
I don't know whether she had a PhD, but she was a doctor from a university, blew herself up, and asking myself, how on earth would someone ever do that? She wasn't poor, and it was, in my view, deep alienation from a system where she saw her neighbors and her community and her people in deep poverty and treated unfairly. And what causes radicalization is alienation. And you see it now because of globalization. We know in real time about the circumstances in which people live all around the world. Consider this one example from Burma. In 1988, 180 of Aung San Suu Kyi's supporters were ambushed and massacred by the junta. And it was 3 months before we knew about it, because it was such a closed-in state in 1988. In the saffron demonstrations by the monks that took place in Rangoon in 2008 and 2009, during those demonstrations, the regime executed a Japanese photographer during the course of a demonstration, and the pictures of that were all around the world within 3 minutes, all around the world, because of mobile phone telephony. Everything's changed. People know today about the contrast between the way they live their lives and the way others live their lives. If you want to know why Brexit has happened in Britain, why President Trump is your president, I submit that it's a feeling amongst a lot of people that there is an elite who are having it well. The 2008 financial crisis, which affected people very deeply, there's an elite of people an establishment who had it very well. In the immigration queue, there's a group of people at the front who are doing very well. And it causes alienation at one level or another. Now, across the bulk of Saharan Africa, moving from the north of Nigeria, where there is a famine pending and where Boko Haram are running riot, across what is happening in the Central African Republic and in South Sudan, where many people are dying and where there's a famine pending, across to Somalia, where much progress has been made, actually, but by climate change and the ever-present drought there is driving people towards famine, and then up into Yemen, where a famine is pending. A country of 27 million people is being blockaded by a coalition of which Britain and America are a part. So these people are not starving, they are being starved, and we in Britain and America are complicit in this. And then you move up into Syria, where a country of 22 million people, 11 million people are on the move. These are not poor people. 5.5 million of them displaced in Syria, 5.5 million outside, of whom 1 million have come to Europe. And you see a member of the Permanent Five at the UN treating Aleppo in much the same way as the Nazis treated Guernica before the Second World War, doing to the UN in terms of international humanitarian law and war crimes, precisely what the Germans and the Italians did to the League of Nations in the 1930s. You can see the sense of alienation among people. And if we don't address this, then that can harden into something much, much worse, which you then have to confront with hard power. Now, how much better to use the many, many sinews of soft power to do something about these grotesque inequalities which exist in our world, which are now so well known and understood, than to wait until you have to use hard power to confront them. The World Bank has produced many reports, all of which show very clearly that the cost of dealing with conflict is many, many times greater than the cost of trying to address the causes of conflict at a point where you have some possibility of having an impact on them.
Mr. Mitchell, this audience and the kinds of folks that come to think tank events like this are the choir. So they're probably, we're preaching to the converted here. I suspect you're going to have a series of meetings on the Hill and at other think tanks and hopefully with administration officials who are not necessarily converts or not necessarily like folks like myself that pay their mortgage on this stuff, to put it that way, right? So I think there is a question in Washington in the highest levels of the foreign policy establishment, including in the defense establishment and in various parts, senior parts of the Republican Party, that are highly skeptical of the efficacy of the foreign assistance business model. So here's the question, and I hear it or it's kind of there in the room, is does this stuff really work? So if you were at a pub back in your parliamentarian, and I don't know what you call it, is it a parliamentary district?
Constituency, the royal town of Sutton Coldfield.
Thank you. In your constituency, if we were in a pub, I suspect you would have folks come up to you and say, Mr. Mitchell, does this stuff work? I mean, I think that question is, they're oftentimes too polite to say it to me because they know I pay my mortgage on this stuff, but what is your answer to the question? I know there's reams and reams of studies, and I'm not looking for that. When someone asks you that question, I'm sure you get that question, does this stuff work? What's your answer to that?
Well, that's why you have to have a results agenda, which is I think now widely accepted. You have to be able to show that for every pound you're spending, you're getting your 100 pence of value for that money. And you're quite right, in the clubs and the pubs, what really angers people is when they hear the money's being misspent, or they hear it's being corruptly taken.
Or on dopey things.
Or on
crazy things, or on first glance sounds stupid. Or
yes.
I think there's a Daily Mail correspondent whose full-time job is just to dredge up these sorts of things in UK aid. Is that? It seems as if
there's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of that. But I can go to the end of the process and give you an example of what you're talking about. Defeating ISIL. We are in the happy position that everyone agrees that ISIL needs to be defeated militarily. But that is 10% of the job. And it will be defeated very easily. 90%. Militarily. 90% of the job is stopping what is support for a death cult. And doing that is much harder, and that requires soft power. Hard power will defeat ISIL in Mosul and Raqqa and kill
the bad guys.
The bad guys. That's not in doubt, and everyone agrees about it.
Sure.
We were talking in the earlier meeting about this. Everyone agrees about that.
I'm all for it.
But that's the easy part. It is persuading people not to engage in this stuff and to build their own communities and their societies, which is much, much more difficult. And that's where international development and soft power comes in. It is by trying to build a rule of law, accountability, so that for investors, so that people know their money won't be stolen by a bent politician or a warlord, that there are courts that are fair, an independent judiciary, the sinews of statehood, and a health service, and so forth. Those are the ways in which society progresses, and progress is made, and that's what soft power tries to support.
Excellent. I could take a couple of questions. This woman here and my friend Tony. These two. name and organization, and you get extra points if it's short.
All right. Thanks. My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm a contractor at the State Department. I work in INL, which is International Narcotics and Law Enforcement.
Anti-drug
Drugs
stuff.
and thugs, there is that. So thank you for your presentation and this conversation. I appreciate it. I had 2 questions, which I will make very quickly. The first would be, as it relates to the value for your money. And
value for money.
Value for your money. Thanks. And and I guess kind of as you talk about soft power, what are the indicators for success? I mean, if you're looking at generational changes, how do you measure that in real time? And how is there this indicator for success if you're looking at a generational change? I don't know if that question makes sense, but and then the second would be.
So just to be clear, I've understood that. You're saying how do you
measure success? How do you measure success, right?
Right, what would be indicators of success? I mean, you could have a training and 50 people come out of that training, but the benefits of that training could potentially not be seen for another 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's just a very basic example, right? I mean, that's really kind of the...
And you're not looking for a deep treatise on measurement and evaluation, sub-criteria or sub-indicators. It's just a little bit further elucidation on how, when you think about it, what would you look at for success? What would success look like from where you used to sit?
Yeah.
Sure, and again, as it relates to kind of the evaluation of the agencies and how you're spending your money, where does donor coordination come into that? The way you were looking at values for success, and kind of the if you're furthering British interests.
The division of labor. Who should do what? Should the Brits do Anglophone countries? Should the French do Francophone countries? Are you getting at sort of the issue of what should the State Department do and what should AID do? Is that or are you thinking more broadly in terms of sort of internationally as well?
Well, yeah, I would say both, really. I mean, how is there that interagency coordination in addition to coordination amongst different countries, different international organizations?
You might just reflect a little bit on that in terms of your interaction with the World Bank or the African Development Bank. I want to hear from my friend Tony.
Thank you.
Can I just try?
Well, let me just bunch them. Let me bunch them together if you don't mind, Mr. Mitchell, because I think we're short on time. So my friend Tony, and then my friend who used to be at IBM. That's all. We only have time for those 3.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for being here. I'm Tony Barclay. I teach at Georgetown University.
Used to run DAI, one of the most successful international development companies in town.
I have a great many friends and colleagues in the UK who feel just as powerfully as Dan does about your legacy and your leadership. I wanted to ask a question about what I think is probably a common theme in the UK and the United States, and that has to do as the Conservative government has sustained and then reached the 0.7% level of GDP. It seems that there's been pressure to do more with less in terms of, if you will, the operating cost structure, personnel of DfID. This was first voiced in the United States in the Carter administration for USAID. And it really was only in the late when Dan was there with Henrietta Fore that USAID began to kind of restaff its technical staff. So I wonder, particularly that with the current Secretary of State for International Development being really skeptical about DfID, whether you think the needle might have tipped a bit far, and whether there is still the possibility to attract career development professionals in the technical disciplines to DfID. My sense is that depth is not what it was 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and just to reflect on that. Thank you.
Okay, I would just make an editorial comment. I consider DfID to be one of the, I agree that it's always a risk. I'm such a great fan of DfID's technical leadership. They're really one of the great, and I'm sure you agree with that too, Tony. Okay.
Good morning, Tim Docking, and amongst other things, I'm currently the co-chair of the Private Sector Advisory Council for Millennium Challenge Corporation. And so I'd like to bring you back to some of your earlier comments on the private sector. I feel like UK development space is several steps further down the road than we are here, and as we try to think of good ideas to bring the private sector in, would really appreciate some of the best practices you could share with us on doing that, really trying to grease the skids for private sector engagement, what the future of that might hold for us here in the United States.
Great.
Thank you.
That's all we've got time for. But thanks for putting up with me pile in
Okay.
a whole bunch of questions in the queue for you.
All right, let me try and do justice to the questions if I can. First of all, on the point 7, doing more with less. In 2010, when Britain was going through a period of very great austerity, we were, if we look at the figures, we were seeking to do far, far more than Mrs. Thatcher was doing in the early 80s in terms of reducing budgets. And every department had to lose 25% of its staff, effectively, 25% of its administrative cost. And I used to sit round the cabinet where my colleagues, with their heads in their hands, were having to serve up to the Treasury these extraordinary levels of cost reductions at a time when the DfID budget, of course, was increasing. And, you know, be under no illusion, although it was tough, we did manage at a time of great austerity to, and I thought it was exactly the right thing to do because, you know, it's not right to balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world, and we increased to the 0.7 as we promised we would, and we did it on time. But at the same time, we did also manage to increase support for development. So we were making the case. Now, in terms of doing more for less, we did a deal with the Treasury, which was that we would reduce our admin cost by the 25%, but that with increasing program cost, it would be crazy to cut the staffing. We had to still maintain, you know, people who could run these programs. Now, you might say it's a bit of a fudge, and it was a bit of a fudge, but you cannot have a massively increasing budget and reduce your staff. And you've got to be able to attract the very best people. And, you know, when I left university, the civil service, the places people really wanted to go to work were the Treasury and the Foreign Office, overwhelmingly. And now, I don't know whether it's true now, but it's certainly true in 2012, the places they want to go to are still the Treasury and DfID. And in fact, I think there's now a system of recruiting where they try to stop people from going to DfID by the way in which you apply, because DfID is so popular. And, you know, what Dan said is true. I have personal experience of this. DfID attracts and continues to attract absolutely outstanding people. And what I always used to say to them was we need to attract people who are brilliant on development, but also who see themselves as civil servants. And I used to ask, when I was the shadow spokesman, I used to ask civil servants in the field, DfID staff in the field, whether they saw themselves as civil servants or developmentistas. And after I'd done it a couple of times, word clearly went round, and I got these absolutely brilliant answers, which didn't really answer the question. But DfID continues to attract extraordinarily able people. But the deal with the Treasury address the particular point. Now, you mentioned about Priti Patel not being very much in favour of development. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, the reason why people think that is because on a wet Thursday afternoon 5 years ago in Wigan, in Britain, she said something just obliging about whether DfID should remain as a separate department. But if you hold politicians to account for everything they say on a wet Thursday afternoon in Wigan, you know, we all say things which we don't mean on a wet Thursday in Wigan. Not that I've got anything against Wigan.
No, of course.
And I think, you know, what's happening now is I think that she's come in from outside with no development background, and what ministers are supposed to do is if they don't have a background in something, is to look at the arguments which the civil servants serve up and make a decision on behalf of her government, her party, her country, and try and get that decision right. And I'm very confident that such is the quality of the officials in DfID, that they will be brilliant at putting before her the case which she must decide, and that she will decide that case and will go out and proselytize for it. But, you know, I should make it very clear in her defense that she has hit a headwind of animosity towards development, where if you haven't got the background and the experience, it's quite difficult to confront that. But every day that goes by, you know, and she's doing this job, she will be learning from the civil servants about what really matters and what doesn't, and I think she'll do it very effectively. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So that's that question. On the MCC and the private sector, we looked at the MCC in opposition, and I came across and spent some time with them. And I think the MCC is a very brilliant way of doing it because it embraces the long-term nature of development. It puts hefty amounts of funds behind it, and it signs up to a series of principles, and the partnership principles are terribly important. They are not a rich country imposing on a poor country a set of conditions, which often doesn't work, because if the poor country doesn't really believe in them, they won't do them. But which sets out from the beginning what the partnership principles that both sides sign up to shall be, and agrees that that's at the heart of what is being done. We didn't introduce in Britain an MCC because we have other ways of doing it. We had partnership arrangements with direct budget support and so forth, which were much smaller generally, but which we thought worked pretty well. But the MCC proposition, I think, is a very strong one, and it's a very good way of engaging with the private sector. And there's all sorts of ways in which the private sector can operate, quite apart from the one I've described, which is the sort of CDC investment approach with patient and pioneer capital. You can also use challenge funds, where, for example, a British business would bring goods and services from a very poor country. If the funding gap wasn't so great, maybe you can use taxpayers' funding to help through challenge funds close that particular gap. That's one way of doing it. There's a whole myriad of different ways in which a private sector department, looking at ways of boosting the beneficial effect of the private sector in raising living standards and creating economic opportunity and so forth, can be carried out. And then your question from over there. Two of them. First of all, you mentioned about measuring success and value for money in results. It's very important to agree at the outset how you're going to do that, because otherwise, in a sense, you're getting on a train to an unknown destination. You know where you're going, but you don't know how you're going to get there. And you must therefore try and be precise about the results you seek to achieve. And if I can give you two examples, we had a big family planning summit in Britain to raise money for family planning. Now this is a fraught political area because the left don't like women's rights being encapsulated in just one thing. And they believe family planning is an issue in women's rights. They don't like it being prioritized. And on the right, of course, it gets into faith groups, abortion, and related issues. So family planning, you have to keep it quite narrow. And what we did was we ratcheted money in on the basis that what this is seeking to do is to enable girls and women to decide whether and when they have children. It's about giving that power to individual women. Very powerful, very important. Everything flows from that. Often, it is. I remember going to a family planning clinic, which we, the Conservative Party, have been responsible for setting up, and seeing this lady come in who said that she feared she was pregnant, and it would be her 6th child, and it would break the structure of her family. They couldn't have another child. She was terrified that she was pregnant. And I watched the reaction from that woman when she was told she wasn't. She was then given access to family planning and so on and so forth. She had tears streaming down her face. She screamed and laughed and cried and did a dance because it was so important to her. She knew that the impact of yet another child would destroy her family. And so it's incredibly important. And in the end, we worked out that if everyone stuck to their agreements, and it's complex because it's a complex mathematical formula, but effectively we would have reduced by 50% in the world the number of the poorest women who wanted access to family planning but could not get it. And if you look at a country like Mali, which is economically very insecure, people starve in Mali, population is out of control. It's an area of concern in terms of terrorism and so forth to the American government. The fact that the prevalence of family planning is so low there, so many very poor people want access to it and can't get it. It shows you why this is so important. So the result there that we are seeking to secure is that you reduce by 50% the number of poor women, and it needs to be monitored. There'll be another summit in London this year, which I hope will look very carefully at whether people have stuck to the promises they made. Britain has stuck to its promises. We need to make sure that everyone else has done so as well. And again, you know, we had another summit on vaccinations, where we were able to say to the British people that Britain, the British money during the period, 5-year period of the Parliament, would vaccinate a child in the poor world every 2 seconds, save the life of a poor child every 2 minutes from diseases that none of our children in Britain die from, thank goodness. So if you're looking at long-term measurement, apart from the obvious, those are very specific ways you can tie it in. And what was your other question?
A division of labor between, let's just use the international system. What should be the burden sharing, or how should we divvy up the international development work?
Well, I think there's 2 answers to that. The first is that the multilateral system does that, because you know there's one agency responsible for X, and we all put our money into it. And you know, you've got to get the burden share right there. And I think that once you agree that an agency is effective, in other words, once there's a sort of universal multilateral aid review for what they are doing, then you know different countries will have different priorities. But that divvies up, in a sense, divvies up the burden share, and that is right. In terms of bilateral spending, you know, in the end, someone's got to take responsibility for making that decision. In Britain, it is the Secretary of State for International Development, but he or she will do it in conjunction with other departments. You know, the Foreign Office will have a view, the Climate Change Department will definitely have a view, and you reach a consensus. And sometimes you'll have pooled money, which cannot be spent unless you've got that consensus. And other times, you know, the person responsible, who leads DfID, will have to sit down, as I did in 2010, with a spreadsheet and say, you know, we're not going to do that anymore because our historic connections there are not as strong as elsewhere. We must therefore, to be sure, try and make sure that other countries do it, or other organizations do it, so you don't just have a break in spending, and that we'll prioritize this and not prioritize that. But clearly, you know, it's much easier if you've got a rising budget than if you've got a declining budget. If you've got a rising budget, a lot of these circles can be squared. And a rising budget gives you the power to think these things through. If you are running hard to catch up because your budget is being cut, then that's a very different matter. It's a much harder task. And you know, I end on this point, I think, Dan, that for an administration that is looking to increase spending on hard power and stop spending on soft power for the reasons we've been discussing over the last hour or so, that isn't very smart, because once you need to deploy hard power, it will become, if you stopped the use of and the understanding and the projection of soft power, then it's likely to be much more violent, much more expensive, and much more corrosive of the international situation.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Mitchell for being with us.